or is the problem lying more in the execution of the command? And you will see my results actually show that it's the problem with the execution, and we have some things that support it. So that's where this is coming from a very fundamental motor control point of view. I just want to make that very clear, because I think that message often gets lost in the way how we do it. And I'm a physical therapist by training, so at the heart of all of it, I always have my patients. While I love the basic research in motor control, it's helped me understand a lot of things. I'm more so interested, as Daniela mentioned, in terms of movement production, right? So why are some patients not able to improve to the same extent as the others? People who are therapists over here, either physical or occupational therapists, or those of you who see stroke patients as part of your research, you will agree with me that there's always this one or two people who act contrary to what you expect, and they just don't improve no matter what we do. For us clinicians, we know, we say we throw the kitchen sink at these guys and still they don't improve. I probably have some idea on what we can do with those people. Not all solutions, but maybe one step in that direction. I mean, you guys all know about this, that stroke is a leading cause of disability in North America. People have problems with their upper limb. At the end of the day, even 6 months after a stroke, almost about 2/3 of these people are unable to effectively use their more affected side for performance of daily activities. People still have trouble doing that. And we know that recovery from stroke extends well beyond the course of usual rehabilitation. So we know that sometimes rehab, like I know in San Antonio, for example, people go from the acute to the subacute setting. If they're lucky, they might get some outpatient rehab. If not, there's nothing. People are just going home and doing nothing. Whereas when I was in Canada, we had a very different setting. People got up to like 6 months of rehab. But we know that it just doesn't stop at 6 months. There was a wonderful paper that came out, I want to say, I think in 2005. If you guys haven't read that, it talks about it was a paper by Steve Page, and it talks about the plateau in stroke rehab, the Gwenda stroke rehab plateau. And he had a very interesting analogy that I use even today for my students. He said that a problem today with stroke rehab, and though this was 15 years old, I think it still holds true to a certain extent now, is like, what happens if we lift dumbbell weights? Beyond a point, we just get adapted to it. You keep lifting 5 pounds, it's not going to feel the same for us beyond a point. I think in stroke rehab, when we see a plateau, it's because we're not challenging the system enough. That's what he had to say. We have to progressively keep challenging to higher levels, and that's how people are going to get better. So I always use that to say that recovery extends well beyond the course of usual rehab. We are mounting evidence, like this was a very interesting case study in 2017, where they had recovery of the hand 23 years after stroke happened. And we know that this recovery is attributable in part to adaptoplasticity and motor relearning. Jessica has a wonderful paper that spoke from her postdoc, where she spoke about mechanisms of spontaneous recovery. So this is in addition to spontaneous recovery. That's why I said in part. So once spontaneous recovery is over, whatever is coming out is because of adaptoplasticity and motor learning. And we firmly believe that rehabilitation interventions can access these adaptoplasticity mechanisms through motor learning. Motor learning is sort of the process behind how we can get to adaptoplasticity. And this is the classic definition of motor learning by Schmidt and Lee, where it's the internal processes. You need practice or experience. And how do you say somebody has learned? You say somebody has learned when behavior improves. How do I say you know how to ride a bike? You ride a bike without falling down, right? You can't tell me what exact steps went into learning. You're not going to tell me, oh, I sat like this. I put so much weight on this side of my body. I put so much weight on that side. I put so much pressure on this pedal. I put so much pressure on that pedal. No, it happens. It's implicit learning. It happens eventually. But before we speak about that, we need to make a distinction about, are we talking about adaptation or motor learning? And I think this is a very important point for us to come and make this distinction, because when we talk about adaptation, we're talking about a temporary change in behavior that lasts within one session. So you look at something pre and you look at something post, and you're seeing the change within the same session. Whereas when you talk about motor learning, it's a more permanent change in behavior. You need to have some retention testing after a period of time. It can be like 20 minutes, 30 minutes. You can have short-term learning. You can have ultra short-term learning. You can have longer-term learning. It can be 24 hours. It can be 1 week, 6 weeks, months, years, no matter what. So when you talk about true definition of learning, there has to be a retention test after a period of time. So although my title says motor learning, what I'm dealing with is adaptation. We are only looking at within session change as far as the study is concerned. Then the second thing we need to consider in motor learning is what kind of task is being used. What task are the patients performing or the people who are as participants in the study performing? So you can either have a task that involves sequence learning, which is defined as the acquisition, coordination, and sequencing of movements, finally to give us a well-executed behavior, or adaptation learning, where you develop the capacity to compensate for sudden changes in the external environment during task performance. And both of these tasks are used in studies that address motor learning from a motor control perspective. So here are examples of these tasks that we classically see. So sequence learning, there's wonderful studies by Boyd and Winstein on this amongst others. And where, you see these 4 kinds of things on a computer screen, or you might see 4 colors, and then you have to immediately go and press a button that corresponds to this. And unknown to you sequences are repeated. So people will learn that these sequences are repeated. Then when you change the sequence, you see again the timing go up, or if the sequence is repeated, timing go down. So that's how we see how people learn pretty well. Or you can do the same thing, like where you have to trace. You can use like a manipulandum handle and you trace these kind of sine waves or cosine waves, and people see how good you are at doing that. When you talk about motor adaptation kind of tasks that are used in motor learning, you have either adaptation to a velocity dependent load, where you're moving suddenly and then it rotates. So you have the rotor pursuit task and you have to go back and learn to change directions. So this is how people do in baseline. Suddenly you see where there's a kind of a perturbation. So you end up at a side. At the end, you become fairly good. You're pretty good at the end of it. Or you have adaptation to a position dependent load. Like you have a spring-like load. The more you move, the more resistance you get. And what happens to that? So we use something here. We use something to like an adaptation to a position dependent load in the study. Now, when we talk about motor learning, though there are many, many theories, primarily motor learning has been addressed under the internal model and equilibrium point theory models. I know equilibrium point theory is still old, Mark. I know we now use threshold control theory and other points. I still use equilibrium point because people still like that. It's still a more of a terminology that's still in vogue. So we still need to get towards the TCT, or the threshold control theory, as that's called now. So internal model theory came from an engineering approach. It came from either the inverse or the forward dynamics approach was there. And they posit that there is an internal model or some sort of representation in the brain that represents an exact matching between the motor and the sensory information. And these models are supposed to evolve continuously when you learn. Whereas the equilibrium point or the threshold control theory, I believe personally, it's my opinion, it's more physiological. There is a presentation of physiological variables controlling where in the joint muscle space, where in the joint space muscles become active. And learning here involves issue of the appropriate commands to produce shifts in muscle activation thresholds. So let's delve a little deeper into the theory. And I cannot cover this theory up within 15 minutes or 20 minutes. I'll try my best. But if you want to learn more about this, read any of Mark's books, because that helped me personally understand. Although I trained under Mindy Levin and Anatole Feldman, read papers by Mindy and Mark to understand the basics before you read the classics of Anatole, because only then will you be able to do justice to his work. Otherwise, don't try to read it automatically. It doesn't work. We have to remember that the important components in the EP theory are you have lambda or threshold length, and you have the 2 commands, the R command and the C command. So I'm just going to talk about 3 variables. I'm talking about lambda, R command, and C command. So lambda is a control variable or something that's directly controlled at the level of the muscle. And R command and C command, you can talk of it at different levels, right from the joint until the entire body. For this presentation, I'm going to talk only at the level of a single joint. I'm keeping it very specific, guys. I'm talking about the commands that come to produce motion at the level of one single joint. So here's a diagram that helps you explain. What you see a little bit over here, these 2 black curves that you can see, which these are the torque angle characteristics. So you can see this is the torque and the angle. So this is the torque angle characteristic And say, for example, you have a joint that's in equilibrium. You're just standing like this. So see my hand at this position. You're going to be over here. Okay, I'm kind of more flexed, say 90 degrees of elbow flexion. And now I get a command to say that I want to extend my elbow. Okay, so what needs to be done if I need to have successful elbow extension is that my flexors need to lengthen and my extensors need to shorten at this particular stage, right? So that I don't have any other problem. I can get the motion that I need to without any issues. It's a simplistic model. Think of it as a very simple level for a single joint. So I have the appropriate R command issue. I have this R dash command where I want to be. And you see the torque angle characteristic moves ahead. So I'm able to move satisfactorily to the new position. And the reason is because the command comes where the system recognizes that this position is actually not where I want to be. It's a perturbation, and that drives me to get towards the new position. The thing I want you guys to pay attention is this pink line over here. You see the slope of the torque angle characteristic remains the same. That does not change. And you can see here the flexors are lengthening, the extensors are shortening, the movement is completed. We have now moved to a new position where we are in equilibrium. So we were here, we are here because the appropriate R command that was essential for us to move to this new position was issued, and that is done. Sometimes you don't need that motion. You need to be co-activating. You need more stability. You don't need mobility. So in this case, like if you see over here in the second part of the figure right now where you can see my cursor, if you issue the appropriate command where you need co-activation, what happens is you see that the slope, as can be shown in the purple dotted line, that slope changes. And you have a co-activation, which means you are activating both your flexors and your extensors. And there is no motion, but there is more stability at this particular point. Okay. Now, we spoke about lambda or the joint activation threshold. For all of us, no matter where we are in our joint range, we can produce force even at the very edges of our motion. We might not be able to do it very well because of biomechanical constraints, but nothing precedes us from producing force at this point or from producing force at this point. We can do it very well. That's because we are able to regulate the range of our thresholds. And this allows us to specify any level of torque at any joint angle. So if you see this over here, we have this entire range at which we can work over it. We are only limited by our biomechanical range. And this was done in healthy adults. This was studies that Mindy has done, Dr. Levin has done in the 90s. There are classic papers that you can see with this. She did some on her own, some with Dr. Feldman, you can see. And only very few times we actually found that thresholds could be done. Only if you move really very fast were you getting any thresholds out over here. So our range of regulation of thresholds far exceeds a biomechanical joint range when you have a nervous system that is not damaged. Now, suppose you have a nervous system that has been damaged because of a condition, say like stroke. You have a limited joint range in which the control is possible. So if you see over here, it's not through the entire biomechanical range of the joint. It's only in a very short range we might be able to regulate our thresholds. So the range of regulation is far limited. How do we know this is possible? Well, there was a beautiful study done, and this is the kind of the torque angle, the velocity angle characteristic. I'll talk about that in just a short time. So this is what was done by Dr. Levin in a study in 2000, even in 97, they had these papers where these are stroke patients, as you can see. So you might have a stroke patient who has no problem at all, very mild stroke. You are able to produce free motion everywhere. Or you have this stroke patient, as you will see here in dark blue, where movement can be free. Here there is no problem. You have good reciprocal activation. Here you have motion only possible by co-activation. You're able to move, but you're going to have co-activation. You're going to have both your flexors and your extensors activating. Or you might have one point where movement is just not possible. Or even as some of the therapists and the others who are dealing with stroke patients, we ask stroke patients to move too much. We sometimes see movement in the opposite direction to what we want them to move. It's because of overactivation by the antagonists. As you come down, you will see that this is very varied. Again, we have different stroke patients over here, but here you see somebody who can either move or not move at all. Or some patients, look at S11 and S12. There's only a very narrow range within which you are able to regulate your thresholds. So there's only very few range, little motion where you have good proper reciprocal motion. The other places, either motion is not possible, or as you can see in the range of S10 and S11, only little motion might be possible, even S9 by coactivation. So this is normal. This is what we see in stroke patients. Anyone who's seen a stroke patient, either in the clinic or in research, will recognize this. This is a classic symptom of how we see our patients. So then how is motor learning explicitly addressed under the equilibrium point theory? So I'm just going to do it for a single joint movement here. I'm going to show you. This is an experiment that was done in 1996 by Weeks et al. And it was a very simple experiment. People had to move from one point, which was a 3-degree cursor shown in I, to a final point A, which had up to a 6-degree cursor. So it was a 50-degree motion. So people just had to move from here to here using a manipulator. So initially you were at this point I, and this line over here, the black line represents the torque angle characteristic again. And there is no load. So people were just freely moving. You issued the appropriate R command that for the no load condition, and patients move. So you had to start at I and you had to end at A. So that was what was happening. Now, and this is a recurrent strategy. Given that nothing changes, people will keep repeating this. So that's why we call it as a recurrent strategy. Now, a load was introduced. So after the people started moving, without telling them, we introduced a position dependent or a spring-like load. So when that load was introduced, what happens is that the torque angle characteristic now comes and rests at position B, but not at position C where they are supposed to be, because this is not within the target zone. So the target zone is out of where they have to be. And hence, as a result, they have an undershoot error. They're stopping short of the target. What do people have to do in order to be able to correct this error? You have to now realize, and this is an example, before that, this is an example of an invariant strategy. You were still using a strategy which was good for the previous condition. So you are being invariant in the way how you're doing. You're still using the same thing. But now you have to realize that something is wrong. Oh, I cannot stop short. I have to go further. So I have to change the command. I have to do something. So you have to issue an appropriate new command, which is the R command for this condition. That's called the R load. And what happens when you do that? You end up moving to the position D, where the torque angle characteristic comes to this position C, where you're fixing it. So you have to, all you do over here is you either issue a R no load or an appropriate R loaded command, and you can correct this. And healthy people could do this within 1 or 2 trials. Majority within 1, some within 2. Now, what happens if I change from a load to a no load? You're suddenly moving with a load, and then I take the load out. So what's going to happen? So when we did that, what was happening is, again, people were using the same invariant strategy where they were trying to do this. But here at this point of time, you are having an overshoot error because you're landing at C, but you have to land at B. So you have to now come back to the no load, issuing the no load command. And when you do that, you again come back to this point. So that's about it. So when the condition changes, you have to be able to issue the appropriate command. So you either have to issue the R no load or R load, depending if the load is there or not. Okay. Now the same experiment was repeated in patients with stroke in 2002, where they had 10 people who had a chronic stroke and 6 young healthy adults. And all the subjects made 50-degree elbow flexion movements, very similar to what I mentioned, in blocks of 5 to 10 trials. And the same thing, when load was introduced, they saw an undershoot error, and when the load was removed, they saw an overshoot error. And the error correction patterns were then classified into 4 different categories. So here, if you see that P was the first trial, P1 was the second trial, P2 was the second trial, and C were the remaining trials. So when you introduced a load, you see you fall short. That's an example of an invariant strategy, as you can see here with the T command. But you saw that by the P2, you were correcting it properly. And that's an example of the recurrent strategy. You learn how to correct it, and you're able to issue the same command over and over again. Now, what types of responses we got? So we probably got, so if you go back, I should tell you this. If you look over here, you corrected in 1 trial. You look over here, you corrected in 2 trials. But look at pattern 3 and pattern 4 also. You corrected, but then you continue to make 1 or more errors, or no proper error correction was seen. So we're talking about four different categories here. One, you correct in one trial learning. Two, trial learning. You correct, but then you make a mistake, or there is no specific correction seen. So what did we get over here? We saw that the ability of people to correct depended upon the severity of hemiparesis. And I believe that here they used the Chadok-McMaster scale for defining the severity. So if somebody was a Chadok 5 or 6, they found that these people were actually had a lot more of pattern 1 or 2, which means they corrected for a lot more trials in 1 or 2 trial learning, and pattern 3 or 4 was seen relatively lesser. People who are moderate, I believe this was Chadok-McMaster 4, they had a 50-50. But people who are really severe, these were Chadoks 3 and 2s and 1s, they did correct, but they had a lot more of pattern 3 or 4. So they did manage to correct in about 33% of the trials on average, but they had a lot more trouble in maintaining that correction. So this is an important to say. So no matter how severe the stroke was, people were able to correct this, but the maintenance of the correction was a problem. And these strategies were highly correlated with arm motor impairment, which was the Fugl-Meyer scores, and moderately with executive function. So this is not just motor, but also some cognitive motor, because it's problem solving. So in executive functioning, it's problem solving and it's being flexible. You need to know, hey, I've made an error. Why did I make an error? I probably am not using the right command. I should be able to switch to be able to use the other command. Now, after that, there was also research that came in parallel with these findings, that spasticity is associated with impaired regulation of stretch reflex thresholds. I mean, all of you who have read Mindy's work are very familiar with this, and I'm preaching to the choir here if I'm going to be talking more about it. We also know that the stretch reflex threshold is really sensitive to the velocity of stretch. And this beautiful paper in 2000 by Dr. Levin talks about how disordered motor control is linked to limited range of regulation of lambda or muscle activation thresholds here. So if you see over here, for example, here's a graph from the 94 paper where they looked at EMGs in 4 muscles, and this is when the elbow was being extended. So if you extend the elbow at 100 degrees per second, you start to see that right over here in the biceps brachialis muscle, the EMG activity is increasing much beyond baseline. Okay. And you look at the velocity and the angle characteristic for this particular speed of stretch. Whereas if you stretch at 160 degrees per second, you're starting to see that both the biceps and the brachioradialis now are starting to get active much earlier in time as compared to this. So each of these combination of velocity and angle characteristics are the dynamic stretch reflex thresholds. And when you use all of these dynamic stretch reflex thresholds and you use an orthogonal regression, you get, and you extend that onto the x-axis, you get the tonic stretch reflex threshold. And what do I define here by tonic stretch reflex threshold? Tonic stretch reflex threshold is defined that as that point where, irrespective of the velocity of stretch, whether it's a really slow stretch or a really fast stretch, you are very likely to have alterations in EMG. That's what I mean by this. This is based purely on EMG behavior. So beyond this point, this is the point where you're going to have either coactivation or no motion possible. If you remember those 3 lines, the blue, the purple, and the other dotted line, this is probably beyond this 99 degrees. In this case, as an example, you're going to be landing into that purple zone. So we also noticed over here that patients with moderate to severe hemiparesis in that study by Dunkaus in 2003, we had a lot of terminal oscillations. So patients were doing this, but they were oscillating a lot around the endpoint. So this led me and Dr. Levin to hypothesize that probably we were seeing these oscillations because the movements were terminating in a range which was beyond the tonic stretch reflex threshold. They were probably getting into the zone of coactivation or something where they were not able to control. So you're seeing the flexor and the extensor both activating, and you're seeing this sort of impaired control. So this led us to think that resistance from the muscles could actually be affecting this ability to successfully control error. And we might erroneously conclude that motor adaptation is impaired, the ability is impaired, where actually it's the performance that may be affected. So it's going back to my point I made in the start. The command is being generated properly, but the execution of the command or the end result is what could be a problem over here. The only way that we could confirm this is that what happens if they move in a range where you don't have this problem of opposing muscle activation. You move in a reciprocal range, whereas you move in a range where you're going to have this muscle resistance or this coactivation kind of a thing. Because if after a stroke, your ability to generate the command itself is impaired, it shouldn't make a difference where in space you're moving. Whereas if it is the muscle resistance that is actually affecting your ability to produce this task or adapt to this task or learn in that short session, then you will be able to do it if this peripheral resistance is not there. So that's exactly what we looked at. So the objective of our study was to estimate the influence of spasticity on motor adaptation ability for movements of the elbow joint. So one single joint, one single movement in patients with stroke. And we hypothesized that the final position errors will be corrected in fewer trials for movements within the reciprocal zone as compared to movements into the spasticity zone. And that error correction performance will be related to clinical outcomes. So we did a sample size calculation using G-Power, and we used the data from the Dunkas et al. Study. And using the effect size that we recorded, we finally needed 11 subjects. So this is whom we included and excluded. So we took patients who had unilateral dominant side stroke, 40 to 75 years in age. This is what we found. We had an arm motor impairment level of 3 to 6 on 7 on the arm and hand subscale of the Cherok-McMaster. So we took people who are not just very good, or really very bad. We took a little bit of the bad and moderate and this thing. And we wanted people to have spasticity. We didn't want people who didn't have spasticity for this study. So we took people who did have spasticity. We excluded bilateral strokes, brainstem, cerebellar, or thalamic strokes, because all these three we know can interfere with motor learning, and it will be very difficult for us to know whether the ability itself is abolished or not. Any other neurological or musculoskeletal problems, like if people had a contracture or people had back pain that they couldn't sit for too long or do anything of that sort, or arthritis in the upper extremity or the shoulder, we didn't want any of these people. We were in Montreal, so they had to comprehend English and or French. We also did not want any pain or visuospatial neglect or visual field deficits to be a confounding factor in our study, which is why we excluded people with all those deficits. These are the clinical assessments we did. We did the upper limb motor impairment was analyzed using the Fugl-Meyer assessment. We also used the proprioception subscale of the Fugl-Meyer just to make sure that our people did not have any proprioceptive issues which were leading to impaired error correction ability. Spasticity was assessed both using the composite spasticity index and the Montreal spasticity measure. I like the CSI personally more than the MAS because it does both the tonic and the phasic parts of spasticity. It uses both these components, and the Montreal spasticity measure helped us look at lambda. We looked at the upper limb function and activities of daily living using the streamlined Wolf motor function test. And we also looked at elbow extensor strength because that helped us know how much was the 30% of the MVC that we used to load the joint. And all our evaluation sessions were held at the Jewish Rehab Hospital in Laval. And this is the setup. So the patient was sitting and their hands were put into this, nice polypropylene cast that we had. And the patients were doing the movement when they were here. And this is what they saw on the screen. They had a panic button in their hand. Like if they felt something, they were too tired or something happened, they had this button that they could press and the system would completely switch off. Because we had this, if any one of you has been to that lab, you must have seen the menuplandum that was devised hand-built by Dr. Feldman. We damp these motors a lot, but these are actually motors that operate a car. So they are really strong motors. So we have the safety button that can override everything. Our damping is very, very, very low. So there's not too much pressure, but sometimes patients get tired and they say, hey, I'm not ready. Hey, I thought I was. So they press this button and the whole system will stop. So this is what happened. So we had a group of control patients as well and stroke people. So in the first session, they did the 50 degrees elbow extension movements. So for individuals with stroke, we measured the TSRT in the first zone, in the first session. And then we always said the final target was beyond the TSRT. So say, for example, if it was 120 degrees was a TSRT. We made them move from 80 to 130 because we wanted them to stop that movements in that spasticity range, in that range where they had the coactivation. And we alternated blocks of load, which was 30% maximum voluntary contraction or no load. And we gave them all 16 blocks. And there were 6 to 10 trials in each block. So we didn't want people to be anticipating, oh, I got 6, so the next 6 are going to be this. The number was very random. The computer generated these numbers randomly, so nobody knew how many trials would be in each block. Now, when the stroke patients came back to the second session, they did exactly the same task. However, what we did was that the final target was before the TSRT, that is in the active zone. So to go on to my previous example, if the TSRT was 120 degrees, then we made sure that the patients now moved from 65 to 115. So they stopped at this range where they did not have this coactivation. They did not cross the 120 TSRT. And again, they had the same alternate blocks, and you had 16 blocks. So here's what happened in the experimental paradigm. So they had to move this 1 degree cursor from this initial to the final position. And they were instructed to move as fast and as accurately as possible. They saw a green light. That was a thing to move, and they had to stop when the red light was there. So come back to home position. And these trials were practiced in blocks of 10 trials each until they received 70% accuracy. People knew what they had to do, how they had to do it successfully. Then we started. So we gave everybody a little practice at the start. Data collection was then started. And as I mentioned previously, we randomized these blocks. We had these alternate blocks of load versus no load. And the load was spring-like position-dependent load. So we had a maximum of 30% MVC at the final position. When the load introduced, we saw that everybody made an undershoot error. Whether you were healthy or you were stroke, it happened. And when we removed the load, everybody made an overshoot error. So we totally had anything between 120 to 140 trials per session. We said 16, but the way the computer did it, it's sometimes a 16 to 18 blocks. And we also gave them short rest periods between blocks with longer rest periods after 4 or 5 blocks. This was, of course, all what the patient wanted. We tried to control for it. I don't remember we had anybody who asked us for a really long, like a 10-minute long break or something. So normally the time also we made sure, because we know that we don't want too much time to go on and things of that sort to interfere. So all of this helped us. We kept very close watch on all of these aspects. So then we classified the trials as I previously showed you, where T was the first trial in the change load condition. P1 and P2 were the second trials, and C were the remaining trials. We recorded the position and velocity for each trial with separate transducers. The recording started 0.2 seconds before the movement onset until the end of the movement. And we created angle time, velocity angle of phase plots. So here's an example of an angle time plot. Here's a velocity time plot, and here's a phase plot, as you can see, where angle and velocity were used. And we use these plots to give us inflection points. So an inflection point was defined as the final position of the primary movement and the onset time for the secondary corrective movement. So if you see over here, here's the inflection point where the primary position stopped and where the primary movement stopped and the secondary movement started. And the errors were defined by where this position was. So in basic joint ranges, how much of an error did they make? So was it an overshoot or an undershoot? Were they within that 50-degree range or not? And we classified these behaviors into 4 distinct categories, as I said previously, depending on the number of trials. So if you corrected within 1 or 2 trials, that was pattern 1 or 2. 3 was you corrected, but you made 1 or more errors. And 4 was where no specific error correction pattern was seen. And we denoted adaptation by these error correction strategies. So because your stroke patients are not healthy, anybody with pattern 1 or 2 was grouped into one category versus pattern 3 and 4 was grouped in another category. Here are demographic characteristics. We had 12 participants ranging from, I think our youngest was 44, and our oldest was about 73. And all of them had ischemic strokes of the, I remember, one hemorrhagic, All of them were right dominant and right side was more affected. And you can see a range. So we had people who were quite severely, quite moderate to severely affected, and only one was very good, 6, but he did have some spasticity, which is why we took him in. And these are our TSRTs, and these are our functional ability scores for the streamlined wolf. And we had 8 8 age-matched subjects, 4 males and 4 females in the control groups. This is a representative data. So we had the angle, velocity, and the phase plots. So here's the data for a healthy control subject. Here's for a subject with mild hemiparesis. You're seeing there's a little bit of an oscillation. Look at this with a subject with moderate hemiparesis. You're seeing like the movement is curved, the person's really helping, and you're seeing a lot of terminal oscillations in this person, as you can see over here. So what did we get? So here, just pay attention to the colors. So red over here is the T trial of the first trial in the change load condition where everybody makes an error. So this is like an overshoot error. Then the P1 in blue is the first trial. The P2 in black is the second trial. Then the green is the third trial. The pink and the fuchsia is the final trial. So this is like 5 trials that I want to show over here. So they started from here, the initial position, and moved to this position. When people moved into the spasticity zone, whether you were mild or moderate stroke, we used a cutoff of 50. That was based on our previous results. So anybody who had 49 and below was moderate to severe, 50 and above was mild stroke. So we see that people make an error and then it takes them more time to correct these errors. You're seeing 1 movement, 2 movement, 3 movements, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, so many sub movements, and then you're able to do it. So when you're crossing, and remember over here, the final position was beyond the TSRT. So you're seeing the dotted line as the TSRT. So they are ending the movement beyond the TSRT. Look at the behavior. Look at how many oscillations you're able to see. Look at how many corrective movements people are doing, like 1, 2, 3, and there's a lot of sub movements. And this is what the inflection point that we use, for example, out over here. So when we look at that and we go into the error correction patterns that we see. So in light orange, you can see here trials without load, and in dark orange are trials with load. We can see, and this is where they had to be. So this is perfect within anywhere in the 6-degree final position. We took this as good performance. We see that healthy participants had a lot more of pattern 1, where they made an error and they immediately corrected. Or there was some pattern 2C, where you took more than 1 trial, like you corrected in 2 trials. So either 1 trial or 2 trial learning. But when you move into the spasticity zone, again, representative data from a patient with mild stroke or a patient with moderate stroke, we are seeing that these people had a lot more of pattern 3 or pattern 4, where you see there is no specific error correction in this person. Error, so overshoot, and this is no load. Undershoot, overshoot, maybe something, but again, off. Or see over here, like this person never corrected at all. Or you see some 3, you got, then you're again making a mistake, you got, you're again making a mistake. So people are able to correct, but when they get into the spasticity zone, they are not able to continuously reproduce the same command over and over again. And between group differences, so we looked at healthy and stroke, and we found that the control group actually almost about 80%, 77%, I believe, correct, if I'm right, was that they had pattern 1 or 2, that they corrected in 1 or 2 trials. There was a little bit of error. People did error initially and then they kind of repaired, they kind of improved it afterwards, Whereas the stroke group, again, only about 23% of them or 22% had this pattern 1 or 2, but you had a large proportion where they were using this other pattern. And these differences were statistically significant. And we also found that stroke patients were slower than controls. There's no doubt, we know that. There's nothing new in this, but this just showed again that this is a task where there's movement slowness also. Now what happens? Now it's really interesting to see what happens when they move in an active zone or where they don't have this problem of coactivation. So this is what I showed you previously. Now, when you move within the active zone, look at the behavior. Like I want you guys to see this versus this. This looks very similar to healthy behavior. Okay, there are still errors, they are making this. But look, you're making an error in the first trial, then it takes you 1, whereas the second trial you're learning. Look at also the performance by the stroke patients. You don't see as many of those oscillations, you don't see as many of those problems. You're seeing the behavior is much more improved. It's not perfect, but you're surely seeing an improvement in the behavior. Again, to going by the error correction patterns, this is what we previously saw, where you saw a lot more of pattern 3 and pattern 4. Whereas now within the active zone, you're able to see a lot more of pattern 1 and pattern 2. And irrespective whether you are mild or moderate. And again, when we did group analysis, what did we find? We found out that initially that this proportion of pattern 1 and pattern 2, which was about 22%, that increased to almost 66%. People were able to correct this a lot more, a lot better. Now, the other question is, you guys are going to ask me, we did it 1 week ago. And what I forgot to mention is that we randomized the order. So sometimes people would do active zone, sometimes they would do the TSRT. We didn't have the same order. Or so what people could have remembered, right? You can tell me learning could have happened. There could have been some retention of information. We checked for the movement speed. The speeds were the same. If people remembered what to do, they would have gotten faster, ideally. Even the amount of overshoot and undershoot error did not really differ. So this kind of gave us the confidence to say that the learning was abolished and really it wasn't there, at least based on these parameters that we looked at. Here's one more very interesting finding that we got. So we looked at a proportion of trials in which the error correction was made within 1 to 2 trials, right? And we found that there was a positive correlation with the Fugl-Meyer. We had a rho of 0.87. So if you're better, you correct more. You have more spasticity, you have lower correction. You have better Wolf motor function scores, you do better. And this was when patients were moving in the spasticity zone. We actually found very similar results with different slopes when patients were moving within the active zone as well. Our rows were 0.79, minus 0.87, and 0.83. So data was highly correlated, irrespective of whether you were moving in the spasticity zone or the active zone. Hold that thought, guys. So we saw that there was no change in the no load to the load and vice versa. We saw that these changes resulted in the undershoot and overshoot errors respectively in both the groups. Whether you were healthy or stroke, load was introduced, you made an undershoot error. Load was removed, you made an overshoot error. In the stroke group, voluntary movement into the spasticity zones influenced your ability to correct these errors. When the spasticity zone was not taken into account, that is when we stopped beyond this, like into a move, when the movement stopped within the zone, subjects showed a higher proportion of patterns 3 and 4. When movements were made in this control zone, what we called as outside the spasticity zones, stroke subjects used significantly greater proportion of patterns 1 and 2, like healthy subjects. The peak velocity for the movements for the C trials and the amount of overshoot and undershoot errors were not different between the sessions. And error correction behavior in both sessions strongly correlated with scores on clinical assessments. Thus, scores on clinical assessments may present an incomplete picture of error correction ability. This is because for, again, all of us who have used Fugl-Meyer, do we tell patients that, hey, you're only moving in the zone of free thing, or you have to move your arm this much or this much? We don't take zones into account. So maybe that is why it's not, I'm not saying it's bad, but when you're looking at something as specific as error correction ability, classifying them, just saying, oh, someone has a high Fugl-Meyer or someone has a high Chidok, that's why they're going to do better, that might not be good for us in this thing. We just have to be a little careful in how we are interpreting these results. And these results indicate that successful error correction behavior is associated with the location of the target. That is, if it is within or outside the spasticity zone. And results of this study suggest that arm motor learning ability, and I'm taking adaptation as part of the learning process, is influenced by deficits in the regulation of stretch reflex thresholds. Thus, presence of spasticity zones should be taken into account when we interpret results of motor adaptation studies, especially in individuals with stroke or any other condition where we might get spasticity. The clinical implication is we know that better recovery of post-stroke arm motor impairment and function may be ensured by incorporation of not only the basic elements, which are identified as pertinent to optimize motor learning and recovery. We have these wonderful papers by Klein and Jones, the 10 principles of experience-dependent plasticity. We all know those, they're all great. But also participant-specific characteristics, including the presence or the absence of spasticity zones and their location, need to be taken into account. I want to acknowledge Dr. Daniela Matos and the Department of Neurology and Rehabilitation Sciences at Washington University for inviting me. Thank you very much. Shout out to my mentors, Dr. Mindy Levin and Dr. Anatole Feldman. I count Dr. Mark Latash also as one of my mentors. He and Dr. Wolf, they both are informal mentors. I've learned a lot from them over years when I've spoken to them at conferences. And quite frankly, you guys don't see this, but I'm shivering in my pants expecting their questions right now here. Thank you to all of you, and thank you to the people who came in the study, Dr. Philippe Archambault and Dr. Valerie Goussev for their programming assistance, late Gevok Shilling-Aryan for the statistical consultation, and we had a brilliant summer student, Cynthia Sino. I wouldn't have been able to do this without her. Thank you very much, guys. Now questions. I see there's already one question in chat. Dr. Carter, do you want me to take that first?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
I was just curious because we're, obviously when I'm seeing patients, management of their spasticity often comes up, and we do it in a lot of different ways. And I am wondering, what would your prediction be if you could test a person in this paradigm who has spasticity, and then you treat that spasticity and bring them back and test them again? I think it would be interesting to see how their performance on this type of test change.
My answer is going to be in two parts for you. So the first would be, it would depend upon what kind of intervention you're using to reduce spasticity. If you're using something like Botox or phenol, you are actually basically cutting off the muscle activation threshold, because the muscle will be electrically silent for a while. So then you will not be able to use it. But if you're using something else, like say probably like TDCS or TENS or electrical stimulation of some sort, or ice maybe to try and reduce the amount of spasticity, then yes, that would be very interesting to see. Or if you're using like something like some other drugs like tizanidine, like oral drugs, then that still needs to be looked at. But with Botox, which is very commonly people ask, because you abolish lambda, you might not be able to get it at all. So that, I think, is still a question that's going on. And there's actually a study which I believe has been sent for publication, or is being prepared for publication, with Dr. Levin, where I know she published a protocol where she looked at TDCS effects and effects of a personalized training paradigm like this. We're still waiting to hear the results of that study. I don't know what's happening. So I would be excited to see if TDCS does help in that or not. That's true, Jessica. Yes, you could do that too at several time points. I mean, you could give them Botox and you could just do EMG analysis and start seeing when it is coming back, and then probably you could see. So there might be a window at which it might happen. It's phenomenal. Like, this is work. I left Montreal after my postdoc, so I'm not there anymore. But if anyone is interested in doing this, is a great study, and I would love to collaborate and work more with this. This really has some very good implications. We just are waiting to see what happens. And this is, again, guys, a very small sample size. I mean, it took me 5 years to get these people. Just think about it. You need people who have spasticity and can move quite fast. You don't want it to be very slow, because if it's very slow, it's quite difficult for us to be able to identify these inflection points and movement corrections. Because people can really do this, and then you won't be able to do it. So it's a very fine balance. So I'm literally coming to the end of the funnel. I'm looking at this proportion of stroke patients who are very, very, very specific. So it also talks about the specificity of the population that we have sometimes for a study of this sort.
Sandeep, may I ask you a question related to the general measures of spasticity, because they all seem to be muscle specific, not joint specific. At least I haven't seen really any analysis of possible role of coactivation and changes in the apparent stiffness of the limbs, which seems to be an important issue for people with spasticity. So have you or Anatol or Mindy incorporated the possibility of measuring coactivation, or at least estimating, and how it interferes with action?
I would say not me personally, sir, but from what India and Anatol have done, like if you look at the graph that I showed, so if I can go back to these graphs, like especially over here, like if you look at this particular thing, we have these patients here who can move sometimes with a little bit of coactivation. So, that is there. Now, I know stiffness is a different concept. I know it depends on whom you're talking to, whether you're talking to an engineer or a physicist. We know that I know that you and Anatol have a very different definition of stiffness from what others may have. And it also depends upon whether it is helpful to you or not. Like, as a physical therapist, I'm thinking about people with spinal cord injury or children with cerebral palsy. Sometimes it is this coactivation that helps them stand. And you want to have that coactivation. It's a good thing. It may not be a bad thing, because the only way people can move is by that coactivation, or they can have that stability to stand, is because of that. So
well, that's exactly the point. So the point is there a way to, using these tools, is there a way to measure the amount of good coactivation and bad coactivation, or to distinguish between the two?
I would say that's a great question, sir. And I'm going to go out on a limb here. Okay, I'm not sure, but I'm thinking I would go back to say probably something like you might want to use something like the UCM analysis, because again, we're thinking about the same thing. This is a little bit of variation in behavior that's actually useful for us. So we need to do further studies and figure this out on what happens if, by some means we are decreasing this coactivation, maybe not completely, but what if we decrease the coactivation selectively, like using Botox in one muscle for like 3 months, and then we see its effects on performance. If it continues to be good, hey, great. If it's deleterious, we know at least it's going to come back. So
Okay,
it has to be a set of studies.
I'm going to now delegate to Steve Wolf, who is ready to speak. Yes, Steve. Good seeing you, by the way.
Good seeing you too. Good seeing all of you. To what extent this observation contributes to the question that Mark's asking, I'll leave for you all to decide. Many years ago, when we wound up doing this constraint therapy stuff, we had to come up with some predictors. And I naively believed that in order to achieve quality movement or to enhance the range of motion, one had to demonstrate clear reciprocal inhibition of one muscle group relative to another. Well, in fact, even with the presence of EMG feedback, we're giving information about muscle activity in antagonist muscles and uptraining or downtraining appropriately. Then when you went into the real world and looked at EMG while people were trying to perform movements, they still coactivate. What they changed, which led to more of a range of functional movement, is that the ratios changed. The ratios changed in an appropriate direction. They don't go away. It's not an all or nothing phenomenon. So there's this continuous interplay. And perhaps, just perhaps, because I don't think anyone's proven this, the extent of what we might call spasticity may be related to how this ratio changes and the consistency with which that change persists as a measure of improvement from spasticity in the context of being able to achieve and maintain some functional change that's relevant.
Absolutely, sir. I agree. And I do believe thinking back, I don't remember, it's been a while since this paper was published and this data collection was finished in 2016 and I left. I still do have the data. It would be very interesting to see, because we did have some measures of coactivation as well. Like we did look at some EMG analysis as well. We never touched it because I was here, I didn't have the tools. But I do believe we can go back and look at coactivation ratios, and to talk about your point, Dr. Wolf, is that we can see how much did the coactivation change. Maybe we're coming to this range of good coactivation is what Mark is talking about. And it might give us some ideas in that direction, but it can be a start for sure. And I know it's already 1 o'clock, guys. I don't see anybody else with any other questions. So if there's not, feel free to email me. My email is there with Dr. This one. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, guys. Thank you for attending. Thank you for staying longer. Thank you. See ya. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Take
a lot.
care.
See ya. Thanks. Bye-bye. See ya.
Thank you.
Bye. See ya. Thank you. Daniela, thank you so much. That was actually very nice.
Yeah.
I was expecting fireworks.